First of all, I just want to thank you all for returning this morning, being here early to meet our wonderful next speaker, Dick Schwartz, who I've had the pleasure to meet for the first time this morning. And I think you have a very exciting and fascinating and interesting hour ahead of you, where you're going to be hearing about the very, very important work that Dick has done, and who is the founder of the Internal Family Systems Model, which many of you are probably familiar with, but if you're not, you're probably familiar with a lot of the terms that have come out of that model. For example, the inner critic, or the self, and how the self relates to self-awareness. There's a lot to say about Dick, but I don't want to take up all that time. He's prolific. He will share a lot about his model.
I just did want to add one or two sentences about Dick. He is truly a pioneer in our space, as many people here know. And, when little kids who are really into sports see an athlete in person, gives them ooh. So having Dick here is a little bit like that. For intellectual junkies, ooh, he's here in person. As Nancy was saying, for those of us who have explored, researched, and tried to help others develop a true understanding of self and the ability to be led by a higher level of consciousness than perhaps older parts or frightened parts or parts that come in to help frightened parts, to give us a sense of who we are at our best. And there are a bunch of different systems, as people here know, for understanding different aspects of self, different voices and dimensions. But truly, I would say my intellectual hero of parts is here, and I've been incredibly influenced by his work, as many people have. I wanted to also just say, again, a word on the connection of winning from within, which some people in this community are also familiar. I think people here know that the hero's journey and the heroine's journey is a big part of my work. But in terms of thinking about the different parts of us, what they pay attention to and how they function to serve us or not, voice dialogue and internal family systems are by far the two pieces of thought and intervention that have influenced me. So I am super delighted, personally and professionally. Do you get called people's hero often, or compared to a sports figure?
Not around the house.
We do have these little baseball cards, and they say Dick Schwartz.
Sounds like baseball, doesn't it?
Yeah, in this room, it's very inside baseball. That's the definition of inside baseball. So with pleasure, one of our big lights in our field and what we do.
Thank you. Thank you. I can't think of a better introduction that I've ever had in my life. So thank you so much. It's a great honor to be with you. I've heard about Mobius for a long time. I have really enjoyed the exchange with these guys that I've had. And I've also been very interested in bringing IFS out of the therapy office more into the culture and also into the corporate world, because I think that's where the culture gets influenced the most. So the biggest bang for our buck is if we can bring what I call self-leadership to that arena. So how many of you already know something about IFS? Okay, oh, great, okay. How many of you are multiple personalities? Wow, that's the best I've ever done with that question, actually. I don't mean how many of you have multiple personality disorder, but how many have never had this experience? You're in an intimate relationship, you get into conflict, and you find yourself doing and saying things you know are making it worse, and you can't stop yourself. Anybody never have that experience? And the next day you say, who was that? Who took over my bus and drove it off the cliff last night? And that's a good question. That's some of what I'm going to be talking about today, because I guarantee you that if you were to take a second and focus on that anger inside of you and find it in your body, because you can do that, and then get curious. Mindfulness is very hot now, so just get into a kind of mindfully curious place about it and ask it some questions. you would learn that it's not just a bundle of anger, that in fact it has fear, it has other emotions, and it's protecting other parts of you that are very vulnerable and are stuck in bad places in your life. And it's sort of stuck back there too, and it doesn't really even know how old you are at this point. Now that all sounds a bit bizarre to some of you probably, but that was my experience years and years ago. Just a little bit of my background. So I'm trained as a family therapist. I didn't know from parts. I thought the mind was just this unitary mind that had thoughts and emotions. And then I did an outcome study back in about 1983 with bulimia, eating disorder, and family therapy, and found that I could reorganize the families just the way the book said to do it, and still my clients didn't know they were cured, and they kept binging and purging, much to my chagrin. So out of frustration, I began asking them why. And they started talking about these parts. And at first I got nervous because I thought, maybe these are sicker people than I thought, until I started to notice inside myself, and oh my God, I've got them too. And some of mine are as extreme about food as theirs. And they would talk about when something bad happened in their life, a critic would start to attack them. And that would bring up a part that could make them feel totally bereft and empty and alone and worthless. And that feeling was so distressing that almost to the rescue would come the binge and take them out. But the act of the binge would bring back the critic, who's now calling him a pig on top of the other names. And then that would bring that bereft, lonely, empty, young part of them back. And they would be in that vicious cycle all day. But to me, as a family therapist, it sounded familiar. It sounded like the circular sequences of interaction that would escalate over time that I was working with in families and that you'll see in companies too. So I started to fool around with applying systems thinking, maybe a little family therapy technique to these inner systems. And I had heard about the Gestalt empty chair technique. Some of you know about that, where you could have a client in one chair, imagining that a part of them was in an empty chair across from them, and say something to that chair, to that part, and then be the part talking back, and they would move back and forth. And I was hearing about 4 and 5 parts, so I'd have 4 and 5 chairs in my office, and clients would be hopping all around. And I was trying to get them to control these parts or stand up to these parts, because I thought they were what the field was sort of telling me, that the critic was an internalized parental voice, and the binge was an out-of-control impulse. And when you think of them that way, it makes sense to try to control them, or to have the client stand up to the critic and not let it abuse her anymore, or control the binge. And it was getting worse, but I was like that man in a hole with a shovel. I didn't have any other tools, so I was just digging deeper, and clients would come in saying, this is getting worse. And that happened until the first client, at least that I was aware of, who had a sex abuse history, and also cut herself on her wrists, and insisted on showing me the open wounds every session. And I began to talk to that cutting part in a coercive way. You know, I can't let you keep doing this to my client, and I would have her talk to it. And one session I decided I wasn't going to let her out of my office until the part had agreed not to do it that week. A couple hours later of me badgering it, her badgering it, I opened the door, and it finally agreed not to. And I opened the door to the next session, and now she's got a big gash down the side of her face. And I had that reaction. I just gasped and kind of collapsed and said, I give up. I can't beat you at this. And spontaneously the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And that was an historic moment in the development of this model, because I shifted out of that coercive place to just being curious. Why do you do this to her? And the part proceeded to talk about how it needed to get her out of her body when she was being abused. And it needed to contain the rage that would keep getting her hurt if it took over. And I shifted yet again. Now I'm not just curious, but I have a kind of appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. And I can extend that to the part and have her extend that to the part. And the part burst into tears because everyone had demonized it and tried to control it or get rid of it, and went on to talk about other parts it protected. And as it did, it sounded like it wasn't living in the present, like it was still back in those abuse times and still thought the world was as dangerous as it was back then. So it turns out now, 30-some years later, with thousands of people doing this all over the world, we can pretty safely say that all of these parts are like that. They're actually valuable. They contain valuable resources that are and then they're forced out of their naturally valuable states into roles that can be destructive to us, but were necessary at some point in our lives. And then they get frozen there. So it's a kind of radical position in my field. It's been a hard sell over the years, but I'm sort of the Will Rogers of the phenomena. I've never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. And I've used this work with people who've killed people, with people who've sexually molested little kids. And even those parts, when approached from this mindful place, will tell their secret histories of how they were forced into these roles and how much they hate having to do it and how they're still living back there. So, basic position is the mind is naturally multiple. It's a good thing to be a multiple personality. We all have all these parts for good evolutionary reasons. They all contain valuable qualities. But trauma, attachment injuries, have the effect of forcing them out of their naturally valuable states into roles that can be destructive and they don't really like. And so a lot of the goal is to help them find that it's safe to go back into their naturally valuable state. And they also accumulate what I'm going to call burdens. This is a very important concept. So a burden is an extreme belief or emotion that came into your system from a trauma, from attachment injury, from some kind of disturbing event, or that you inherited from your lineage or from our culture. So extreme belief or emotion comes into your system and attaches to these parts and then drives one of them, almost like a virus or a computer virus would. And the unburdening, the release of these extreme beliefs and emotions allows these parts to return to their naturally valuable states. So, and the field has confused, our culture has confused parts with the burden they carry and thought they were the same thing. So this is a very optimistic view of all of this. Now, as I was doing that kind of work, and once I got hip to the fact that they aren't what they seem, I'm a systems guy, I'm a family therapist, so I'm trying to get my client to have a better relationship with their parts. So maybe I've got one of these teenage bulimic kids, and she's talking to her critic who's in the other chair. And I'm trying to have her get along with the critic and get a better relationship rather than fight with it now. And as I'm doing that, I'm seeing that suddenly she's enraged with the critic and the conversation's going south. And it reminded me of family sessions where maybe I've got a teenage kid talking to her critical mother, and I'm trying to have them get along better. And suddenly she's enraged with the mother, and we were taught as family therapists to look around the room and see if somebody's covertly siding with the girl against the mother, and you often find the father's doing that. So ask the father to step back in the room, out of her line of vision, and the girl settles down and we have a better conversation. So boundary making around the mother and the daughter dyad. Maybe the same thing's happening with this inner system. Maybe as I try to get my client to get along with her critic, a part who hates the critic has jumped in and is doing the talking. So I began asking clients, could you find the part who's so angry at the critic, and could you ask it to just step back in there? It's basically the same intervention I'm using with families. And to my amazement, clients would say, okay, it did. And now how do you feel toward this critic? And suddenly clients would say some version of, I'm just kind of curious about why it calls me names. Seconds earlier, they were furious with it, or maybe they were terrified by it. We got the terror to step back. Now, how do you feel toward this person, toward this part? And it would be across client, it would almost be like the same person suddenly popped out and would be curious and also calm and would have confidence relative to the part, and often, sometimes spontaneously, suddenly, would be compassionate, would say, I'm really sorry that it has to do this. I can't imagine that it likes doing this. And would have courage to go in their system and find the parts that the critic was protecting and heal those. And would have much more creativity in how it reacted inside. And I'm going over what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. So anyway, when I got clients in that place, I'd say, now what part of you is that? Because that's great, let's keep that around. And they'd say, that's not a part like these others, that's more of who I am, or myself. So I came to call that the self with a capital S. And this one is even harder to believe. But it turns out, now again, 35 years later, thousands of people doing this, that self is in everybody. And it doesn't have to develop, it doesn't have to come from some kind of external relationship. It's our birthright. And it's just beneath the surface of these parts, such that when they open space for it, it comes out spontaneously and can lead internally, has a wisdom about how to heal internally, and can also lead externally, because it has a wisdom about how to relate in a good way to people also. So that blew my mind, because I'd been trained as a therapist that for people to have that kind of ego strength, they had to have a certain kind of parenting during a critical period in their childhood. And if they didn't get that, they were kind of out of luck until they got it from a therapist or they got it from a spouse or someplace. It had to come from a relationship. And my clients had horrible childhoods. There was no way. I would comb their history to find the person that gave it to them, unsuccessfully. And ultimately, I had to conclude that it didn't come from a relationship. It actually is our birthright. And I actually began to look more towards spirituality, because it turns out that virtually every spiritual tradition knows about this and has a word for it, and virtually very, very few psychotherapies know about it. So this is the big discovery from my point of view, that that's who we really are. And again, I'll go back over those 8 C's. At some point, I began to catalog the qualities that would emerge as people separated these parts and got into this place. And oddly enough, they all began with the letter C. So we have curiosity, calm, confidence, compassion, creativity, clarity, courage, and connectedness. And suddenly, my clients would say, you know, I don't feel so alone right now. I feel like I'm connected to others. And I have a desire to connect that I'm not sure where that came from. A desire to connect to my parts and to other people. So the goal is to help clients get into that place, and it turns out to be much easier in most cases than most people would think to do that. And then once in that place, begin to work with these parts in such a way that they unburden and transform. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions or reactions so far. So I threw a lot of the model at you in just a short period of time. And I'm very happy to entertain skeptical parts. I'd prefer that to looking at your prune-like face the rest of the hour. Yeah.
Last night we heard from kind of some ideas from adult developmental theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how this work differs at different age ranges and kind of how you reconcile it or how it fits in with developmental theory.
Developmental theory. So my position is that we're born with these parts, either manifest or dormant. So infant researchers will talk about 5 or 6 discrete states that infants will shift between. So those are the ones maybe that are online when you're born. And then the others come out almost like a time-release capsule as you develop. So those of you who have children might remember when you put your little 2-year-old to bed and was a compliant little kid and suddenly woke up and said no to everything. Overnight, that part, that assertive part, debuted. And then other parts will debut down the road unless they're forced to come forward prematurely by trauma or attachment injury. So anyway, that's my view of development. What I'm calling self doesn't develop. The hardware develops, your brain develops, so it has more purchase, it has more ability to influence you and to help you in your life. But this concept of self is just there from the get-go. So, yeah. Yep.
Have you looked at all on the influence of intergenerational trauma and how that influences the parts?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time these days working with what we call legacy burdens. So, and you know, the epigenetics has proven that trauma is transferred across generations through actually genetic changes. But these we call legacy burdens, and so we're working with somebody's internal system, and maybe you'll find a critic, for example, and you start to get to know the part, and it's clear that it sounds like the mother, or it sounds like the father, and so you get to know, and at some point we'll ask, so do you carry the father's energy? And it'll say, yeah. Okay, why did you pick up the father's energy? And it'll tell the whole story of how it took on that energy in order to control you because it needed to keep you the way the father wanted so you wouldn't get hurt, and so it took on the energy to keep you in line. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But that would be a legacy burden. You inherited that energy, and he inherited that from his father, and so on down the line. So legacy burdens are a big interest of ours. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Do each of the parts have roles that seem to be defined in relation to other parts?
Yeah.
The critic has a role to protect all vulnerable parts. Anger has a role to protect all vulnerable parts. Is that true?
Yes, so I'm going to use that as a segue to the next piece of the model. So as I was mucking around in these inner systems in the early days, I was finding that my clients were having some pretty severe negative reactions after some of my sessions. And at some point I put 2 and 2 together and figured out there was something I was doing in my office that was triggering them to have a car accident right after they left the office, or spike a big fever, things like that. And so I almost backed away from the whole thing because clearly I was hurting people. But then I got curious and I started asking what I was doing wrong, and their parts taught me this map that I'm going to give to you, not so you impose it on anybody, but so it's a kind of guide as you're in this territory. And it's a map of the roles that parts commonly find themselves in. So the big distinction, again, I'm a systems thinker, I'm looking for patterns. The big distinction that leaped out was between parts that are very, very vulnerable, easily hurt, and then the parts that protect them. So we have protectors, and then we have these very vulnerable parts. So I'm going to start with the vulnerable ones. How many of you have never been humiliated in your life? How about in the last week? So when you had that humiliating experience, what did you try to do with the memories, sensations, emotions, and beliefs that came into you from that? Just call it out. Deny, forget, judge yourself about it, right? Say? Suppress, push it away. Right, so most of us do some version of that. What did the people around you tell you to do with it? Forget about it. Yeah. Let it go. Don't be so sensitive. Just move on. Don't look back. And the business world is really ripe with that message. So I'd be a big advocate of that approach if it worked, but it turns out that you're not just, my language, exiling emotions, sensations, memories, and beliefs. You are locking up inside of you the parts of you that were most hurt by those experiences. And those tend to be your most sensitive parts, who are also, when they're not hurt, your most playful, joyful, creative, spontaneous, fun-loving, intimacy-seeking parts. They're your juice, these inner children. But because they're hurt now, you don't want anything to do with them. They're like radioactive to you. And so you lock them in inner abysses or cysts or caverns and try to forget about them. So for them, it's insult to injury. The injury was getting hurt, initially humiliated, and the insult is you abandoning them and locking them up. And everybody in this room has a bunch of exiles. These we call exiles. Once you get some exiles, then the world is a lot more difficult because the world has a way to trigger those parts. And when they get triggered, it's like these flames of emotion threaten to consume you. And you won't be able to function, you'll feel vulnerable, you won't be able to be in the business world for sure. So we have other parts whose job it is to prevent that from happening at whatever cost. And their job is to manage your life so nothing similar to the original humiliation ever happens again. And they'll manage your relationships, they'll manage your appearance, they'll try to manage your performance. And they're working constantly. When you walked in the door, they would scan for danger. They're just constantly feeding you information. So we call them the managers. This is one class of protector. They all have in common the desire to preempt anything that might trigger these exiles. And often are trying to please people and, often are pretty cerebral, and they often are the critics. Many of them are forced into that role of criticizing you to try to motivate you to do better, to work harder, to look better. Or they're criticizing you to make you small so you don't take risks, so you don't get out there and get hurt again. But they're all desperately trying to protect you, even though they're tearing into you. Is this making any sense? Okay. But there's lots of kinds of managers. I'm just focusing on the critics because that's an interesting topic for this group, I think. So they try their best. Much of the time they're successful. They got you through graduate school. They got you into the jobs you're in. They keep you looking good in this corporate environment. And still, the world has a way of breaking through their defenses and triggering your exiles, at which point it's a big emergency. And there's a set of parts who has to deal with that emergency immediately and get you higher than those flames of emotion, or distract you so you burn itself out, or get you out of your body somehow, or somehow deal with this 4-alarm fire that's happening inside of you. So we call them firefighters. It's a different category of protector. And in contrast to the managers, who often are so careful and controlling, and they are impulsive and take you out of control, and damn the torpedoes, they're going to do whatever it takes, regardless of the collateral damage, regardless of the damage to your body, your relationships, in Trump's case, to the world. He's got a tweet at 4 a.m. That's his firefighter activity, one of them. So we all have firefighter activities, and I'm going to give you a chance to call yours out. So when you get triggered, when your exiles really feel upset, what's your first impulse? Just call it out. Eating is one of mine. Running, I wish was one of mine. What? Isolate, withdraw, right? Sulking is one of mine, says my wife.
Fire off an email I wish I didn't send.
Fire off an email that you wish you didn't send, that's right. Yeah. Controlling, okay. Swearing. Okay. So most of these are pretty benign, but if you're working with trauma like I do, you'll also have cutting, and you'll have all sorts of addictions, and you'll have lots of rage, and the kinds of firefighters that get people diagnosed and get them into institutions and so on. So we all have firefighter activities. Most of us have a hierarchy of them. If the first one doesn't work, we go to the next one. If that doesn't work, the next one. And one that wasn't mentioned so far is at the top of that hierarchy for most people. Any guesses about that? Suicide, right. It's such a relief to know that that's a possibility for most people, for most clients. And here we come along as well-meaning therapists and say, I want you to sign this contract saying you're not going to kill yourself. And you wonder why your client goes crazy. You took away their safety net. So this is the map. Go back to your question. And they all do have relationships with each other. Many managers are polarized with firefighters. They're trying to control the addiction because it's ruining their lives, even though the addiction is desperately trying to deal with the worthlessness that's in there. And so the addicted part is rebelling against the controlling, and then you come in as a therapist and side with the manager to try and so you follow all this? Okay. Yeah.
Should you then distinguish between within firefight activities the sort of the choice, element of choice versus reaction? So
With firefighter activities?
the fever is a bodily reaction, right? There's also maybe a form of firefighter.
Yeah, so,
Versus the choice of suicide.
yes.
Conscious act.
Sometimes it's a very unconscious, impulsive act, which would be a firefighter activity. Sometimes it's more of a soothing, managerial kind of thing, suicide. But my conversation with that suicide part is, why do you want to kill him? What are you afraid would happen if you didn't kill him? What do you think the answers to that question are? It's two common answers.
To keep him safe.
What?
More pain.
More pain.
Yeah.
I can't stand the pain he's in. He's going to get more of it. Let's just call it. Yeah. It's the most common answer. So I'll say to that part, I totally get that. I totally appreciate why you would want to comfort him or take care of him this way. If you would give me a chance, I can show you we can get him out of his pain in a different way. Would you give us a chance to prove that? I don't think you can do that. No, I guarantee we can do that. Would you give me a chance to prove it? So the biggest antidote to suicide is hope. And worked for 20 years with a chronically suicidal population with that basic premise, and almost never hospitalized anybody and didn't lose anybody. So you see, this is a very big paradigm shift for all these kinds of things, for addictive parts, for all kinds of parts, yeah.
Can you link what you're now saying to what you said about noticing that people got worse when they left your office?
Yes, I will. I'll cycle back to that. What was my mistake? So clients would come in and we'd get to know their parts, and they would be talking about these parts that were so hurt and young and vulnerable, and it felt like that's what we need to heal. So I would do my best to get there as soon as I could. And it was those sessions that the clients would have these big backlash reactions. And what I learned the hard way was I was violating the rules of these protective parts who had kept those vulnerable parts locked away for 30 years. And here I come and I open the door right away. And they're punishing my client for having let that happen. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So we learned the hard way to never do that. So now we go to protectors first. We go to them not expecting them to change. We go to them with that message of hope and to honor them for their service, like you might the military, and to learn about what they protect, and then negotiate with that question of what are you afraid would happen if we didn't do this, if you didn't do this? Would you give us permission to go and fix that so you don't have to stay in this role? And if you didn't have to stay in this role, what might you like to do instead? And you'll be amazed by the answers. It's often the exact opposite of what they've been doing. So the critic now wants to be your cheerleader, or the one who makes you withdraw now wants to get you out there. That's their naturally valuable state. So we're trying to free up these protectors, but they will not go for any of that until what they protect has been healed. And what do I mean by healed? And how do we heal these exiles? So, I negotiate permission from a protector. Sometimes it takes quite a while. There's a lot of fear about opening that door to the exiles. Now, over the years, we know how to address each of the common fears. The biggest fear is you'll be overwhelmed. All that raw affect will just swamp you, flood you, you won't be able to function. So we, over the years, learned how to keep that from happening, which actually turns out to be incredibly simple, which simply is to ask the exile if it's willing to not overwhelm. And if it agrees to not overwhelm, they never do. So we'll set that up in advance. And now I'm having my client focus on that part that feels so much humiliation or terror or raw pain or shame, whatever you did exile. Find it in your body. This is how we start with parts. And then, how do you feel toward that part of you? Which is the question we ask after every time we meet a part. How do you feel toward this young, hurt part of you? In answering that question, we learn how much self is present. So if it's one of those C words, we know maybe we've got enough self to actually begin a dialogue. If it's something else, I'm afraid of it, or I don't like it, or, then you ask those parts to step back more until you get, I feel sorry for it, I'd like to help it. Once they're in that state, let it know you'd like to help it, see what it wants you to know. Answers start to come. Sometimes people start seeing scenes from their past where the part is stuck in the past. Sometimes not. Sometimes the little childlike part rejects the self. Where were you when I needed you? You locked me up for 20 years. Why should I like you? Why should I trust you or listen to you? And we have to do a repair. We have to have self apologize for having done that. Until there is a trusting relationship between that young part and yourself. At which point, I would have you ask that child what it wants you to know about the past and where it's stuck in the past. And clients see scenes, feel emotion, feel the sensation, not reliving it because the part hasn't overwhelmed them, hasn't taken over, but self is witnessing what happened in a new way. You're becoming a compassionate witness to your own history. And there's something very healing about that for these parts. And it's not that I'm the witness, it's that yourself is the witness. And when the part feels fully witnessed, it's still living back there. So I would say to you, I'd like you now to go into that scene and be with that little girl in the way she needed back then. And clients, okay, I'm there. What are you doing? Well, I'm holding her and I'm pushing my father away. Okay, and I'm just kind of, okay, now what? Now what's going to happen? Okay, okay, now what are you going to do? And the client just is doing it. And then when we're ready, we take the part out of that place to a safe place, at which point they're willing to unload these emotions and beliefs that have been driving them, at which point, when they do that, they transform into their naturally valuable states. At which point, we bring in all the protectors to see that this one doesn't need to be protected anymore, because it's just a happy little inner girl who now wants to go and play. At which point, we ask them, now are you guys ready for a new job? And they are. They're just eager for a new job. They hate the jobs they've been in. So, there you have it. Don't think I've ever taught the model that quickly. How are we doing for time? I've got 5 minutes, is that true? Oh my God, okay. Yeah.
So, how do you recommend working with this with oneself?
You know, if I had more time, I'd have you do, all right, we're going to do it. Okay, all right. So, take a second, put your stuff down. Think of a protective part of you you'd like to get to know that you usually have been fighting with because it gets in the way in your life. And maybe it is that critic. I mean, we all have one of those. That might be the simplest thing. It's just to take a second and focus on that critical voice inside of you and find it in your body or around your body. And then as you notice it, notice how you feel toward that critic. In other words, are you intimidated by it? Or do you depend on it? You hate it? Want to get rid of it? You have a relationship with this part of you. It might be a combination of those feelings. Just notice how you feel toward this critical part of you. And then, if it's possible, we're going to ask these other parts to give you space to just get to know it for a second. Just to let you be mindfully curious about it. Just for a second. We're not giving it more power to take over and run and hurt you. We just want to get to know it. And if you can't get there, that's fine. You can just get to know the parts that are afraid. But if you can get even a little bit curious about this or toward this critic, then go ahead and ask what it wants you to know about itself. And don't think of the answer. So many thinking parts can step out too. Just wait for an answer to come from that place in your body. What does it want you to know? And what's it afraid would happen if it didn't criticize you all the time? What's it afraid would happen? Just wait for the answer. If you do get an answer to that question, it means it lets you know something about what it's protecting. And see if it's possible to extend some appreciation to it for trying to protect you that way. even if it's hurtful sometimes. Just let it know you get that it's trying to keep you safe. And see how it reacts to that appreciation. Another question is, if you could heal or change what it protects, so it was freed of this responsibility, if you could heal or change what it protects, so it was liberated from this job, what might it like to do instead inside of you? And ask it also how old it thinks you are. Not how old it is. How old does it think you are? And if it thinks you're younger than you are, then just update it. See how it reacts. And last question is, ask this part what it needs from you in the future. And then, when the time feels right, you can shift your focus back out here, thanking that part for whatever it lets you know, if you got that far. So I know we don't have a lot of time. I would love to just gather a few reports, if anybody were willing to talk about what that was like. Let me just start by just asking, how many of you had a kind of interesting experience with that? Okay. Anybody willing to talk about it? Any level of detail that feels safe is fine. Yeah.
So first, such an honor to be in the room with you.
Oh my God. Thank you.
I just have to say
Thank you.
I also have the baseball card. I actually had a wonderful thing happen, which was when I felt it so strongly in my heart. And I've done work on the critic, a lot of work. But when I said to the critic that what they would rather do, what was the second question? What was the second
What was it protecting? What's it afraid would happen if it didn't?
When I appreciated it.
Uh-huh.
Because it was hurt, I felt it very physically. It was
Yeah.
hurting.
Yeah.
The pain stopped completely.
That's all they want. They want a little appreciation.
It just stopped.
That's right.
And when I asked it what it would rather do, it said it would like to just take a break.
Mm-hmm.
It was very clear.
That's the number one answer to that question.
I would like to take a break. And then when I asked how old it thought I was, 7.
Mm-hmm.
And when I informed it that I was significantly older, it said, "Oh my God, Right, I'm off then. And then when it said, what do you most need from me? Just keep reminding me you're not 7.
That's fantastic.
It was just very clear.
That's
So
excellent.
thank you.
Thank you for sharing all that. Maybe one or two more, anybody? Yeah.
And it had even a strategy for me. It was very clear, so I had very similar. And I was working yesterday in my track, and my tendency is to protect everybody around me and to take on. So it was my critic just said, so what do you need? And just set your own boundaries so I don't have to do it. And it was just so clear from your adult perspective. So it had a very clear strategy.
It's great.
With very clear manifestation. I can see it even in my work.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you.
Can you be in my pocket?
No, but you can. You already are there. So, yeah. Yeah.
So I have your baseball cards too, as you know.
Price is going up, actually.
So my excitement is to take this model and continue to use it in my role as a coach to CEOs and to vice presidents and such. Can you speak to that for a few minutes?
Do I have a few minutes? Sure. Okay. So I've worked with clients who were CEOs frequently. Most of them had pretty traumatic childhoods. Their protectors, their managers said, never again am I going to be humiliated, and got into this very striving, kind of workaholic, perfectionistic place that served them through school, served them climbing the ladder, but drive all their employees crazy because they're dominated by those parts. Does that sound familiar? So you go to those parts the same way I just had you go to your critics, and you honor them for getting them safe and there, and what do you protect? And you go and you find the little 7-year-olds that struck out in Little League, and that's one of mine. And you help it. I mean, and worse traumas. Right. And you heal it, and then you go to the striving one, and you get it to change its role, and the client leads from self. And now, because parts are contagious, so if your company is run by a part like that, it's going to trickle down to everybody, one form or another. You're either going to be in these scared parts or these pleasing parts all the time, or the parts that have to, like Donald Trump, tell how great he is all the time. And self is also contagious. So if you can get your CEO into self, then everybody relaxes. And it brings out self in all the employees, and you have a self-led company. So anyway, that's part of my vision.
And can I actually do that if I'm not sort of the therapist kind of person?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't do your job, so I don't know what the limits are. But there's a lot of this you can just bring up in conversation, because people know what you're talking about when you say, oh, so part of you does this to you, and another part tells you this, and this part doesn't serve you, does it? No, it doesn't. Okay, would you like some help with that? I can help you with that. And particularly if you stay at the level of protectors like we just did with the critic, it's very safe. You don't have to, once you go to exiles, it can get dicey, at which point either get the training or refer to a therapist. But just the language and then having people get to know their protectors and change their relationship with their protectors, get a little separation from the protectors, is very useful. Yeah. How much time do I want to...
If you're going to do one more, we should call that the last.
All right, last one. Yes.
So I'm curious how resilient these parts are, these old patterns and habits that we've been carrying around for decades. Like how resilient are they to come back, and how much maintenance and attention do they need? Because do they come back to their familiar place?
Yeah, well, in the early days when I was doing this, I would get all excited in the office, and then the next session was back.
Yep.
And so I learned that there's a maintenance to it. So homework to clients is, you just got to know this critic in a different way, be with it every day this way for about 3 weeks, and that'll make a big shift. So it's that kind of thing. And people can do it. Most people, this becomes a kind of life practice. Just getting to know your parts as they come up and starting to work with them in different ways from self. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed being with you. So now we do have what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. Oddly enough, all the qualities began with the letter C. So curiosity is often the first one to show up. First, they're really furious or they're terrified of the part. That steps back. Now, how do you feel toward it? I'm just kind of curious about why it does this inside of me. Also calm, where they were agitated or scared before. Also confident relative to it, that no longer intimidates them. And often compassion. And I feel sorry for having to do this job inside. So those are 4 of the 8 C's. Then also clarity in the sense that the image of the part would actually change. Looked like a monster, and now it looks like a teenage kid maybe. Creativity. When they were in their parts, they had a very limited range of ways to relate to this one. Now, all kinds of things are possible and how they relate to it. And courage. Not only are they not intimidated by the part, but they now have the courage that they didn't used to have to go to what it protects and actually start to heal that. And then finally, they feel a sense of connectedness globally to humanity, to the earth, and also a desire to connect to parts that they had hated before, or people in their lives that they might have hated before. So that's what we call the 8 C's of self-leadership. There are other qualities like forgiveness often comes naturally, or perspective, or joy. We don't include them partly because they don't begin with the letter C. But these 8 C's are actually the most relevant for the healing process. So we emphasize those.